Yes, I am. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. The time is now 1 p.m. We'll go back on the record where we had left off. Was I believe that Northwestern Energy had tendered Mr. Pankratz, Mr. Pankratz, for cross-examination. Mr. Brown?
No questions. Thank you.
Mr. Nelson? Captain Duffy?
No questions. Thank you.
Mr. Nell?
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Mr. I called you Steinmetz. I'm sorry. Pankratz.
Good afternoon.
If you're not the witness to answer this, just kick it down the road. But I want to ask you about the settlement. As I read the settlement agreement, there's no specific allocation of the increase that was stipulated to that was directly a line item for transmission. Do I have that right?
Objection, lack of foundation. This witness doesn't testify anything about the settlement.
Mr. President, just to respond, he may know what the settlement is asking for stipulated revenue amount. And I'm trying to figure out what portion of that's transmission. He may know that.
Yes, I'm going to overrule.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I'm not the
Okay.
correct witness to answer questions about the settlement details.
Can you answer questions about transmission revenues and costs?
Revenues associated with costs, I'd have to defer that to perhaps a finance witness.
Oh, okay, Mr. Pankratz. So fair enough. We're here on a request from Northwestern to have the commission award or grant a rate increase, some of which will be for transmission costs, revenues, money. That the rate case design is for the test year of 2021. Do you understand that?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. Wouldn't it be right to use the transmission revenues from 2021 for the commission as it's assessing what the appropriate rate should be that Montanans are paying in an appropriate rate design? Wouldn't that be the right way to do it?
Well, again, I think I would have to defer those types of detailed questions about the rate itself to another witness.
Who would that be?
I would probably defer to my counsel, maybe to who the correct witness may be.
Mr. Steinmetz?
Legal. And can you address
Thank you,
that?
Mr. Chairman. If the questions are about the revenue requirement, that's Ms. Rich. If the questions are about rate base, that is Jeff Berzina. And then we also have our CFO testifying.
And that's fine.
The rate design is Ms. Fang.
That's fine. I'll find Mr. President, but to the extent that they're directly related to transmission, I don't want to get there and have somebody say, well, I don't know, that's a transmission question. So I'm fine.
Ms. Hill?
As you can see from Mr. Pankratz's testimony, he does not talk about revenue cost and transmission.
I've noted your
Thank you. No further
request
questions.
on the record.
Thank you.
HRC. Mr. Uda.
I just have a couple. Good afternoon, Mr. Pankratz. My first question is Northwestern currently engaged in engineering and planning activities for design and procurement of equipment needed to construct electric network upgrades for the Yellowstone plant?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Okay, is that a yes? I mean, I'm just want to make sure we're definitive on this.
Yes, to my knowledge, we are, yes.
Okay. Do you know what the expected timeline for the construction and COD for those facilities?
To my knowledge, the timeline in COD is to match the online or COD date of the plant, which, as I understand, has recently been delayed.
So are you holding off in the meantime on those construction activities for the network upgrades necessary to interconnect the Yellowstone plant?
I believe there's still activity going on, yes.
Does that mean that Northwestern is currently incurring costs for the Yellowstone electric network upgrade facilities?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I may have to defer cost-related questions about that, maybe to another witness.
Okay. I was just asking you if you know whether or not those costs are being incurred now. I mean, I assume that they are since you're doing work now.
We do have ongoing work going on, so, but I'm not familiar necessarily with how
The
much
accounting-
cost
the
we're
accounting-
incurring.
The accounting treatment, is that correct?
Correct.
So I guess I would ask Northwestern who the right witness to ask that last question is.
So,
And to be specific before Ms. Hill answers, what I want to know is Northwestern currently incurring costs for the Yellowstone electric network upgrade facilities? Not whether it's seeking recovery at this time, but rather is it incurring costs?
Well, so I'm only prepared to speak to what Northwestern's asking for in this case. And so I'd have to confer for questions outside of this.
That's fine. They can confer and get back to me. I just want to know who I should ask this question of because someone here should know it.
Ms. Hill, do you want to respond to that?
No, I honestly need to confer. I don't know the answer.
All right. We'll reserve this colloquy until another time, perhaps.
Okay, so I want to change topics for a minute. Is Northwestern currently engaged in engineering and planning activities for design and procurement of equipment related to the Byron pipeline?
Apologies, but again, I'd have to defer you to another witness. My area of expertise is just more in the electric transmission area, not gas transmission.
Well, I have a couple more questions on that, so I assume that those would also result in the same answers that this witness doesn't have the information necessary to answer it. So again, I guess I would ask Northwestern's counsel to get back to me about who could answer those questions.
So,
Mr. Chairman, these are questions that would more appropriate for Mike Cashel, and we only temporarily excuse him. So we'd be glad to call him back for those questions. And I also want to clarify a question earlier that I want to make sure I say that Glenda Gibson is the transmission revenue credit if there's questions about that. But we can call for these immediate questions for Mr. Udo. We can call back Mike Cashel.
That would be fine with me. I just need to have a witness. But I may not be holding it close enough to my face. I really not comfortable with this whole procedure.
all right. So how I'd like to proceed is we have Mr. Pankratz on the stand at this point in time. When we're done with Mr. Pankratz, we call Mr. Cashel for a limited, Mr. Uda, line of questioning. All right, dude. You're a witness, Mr. Uda.
I don't have any more questions, Mr. Chairman. I'll defer the questions to the people identified by Northwestern.
All right, thank you, Mr. Uda. No Renewable Northwest,
No questions, Mr. President.
MEIC.
No questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Ellie. Okay, Commissioner questioning this witness. Vice President Fielder,
I have no questions, Mr. President, at this time.
Commissioner Bukajek. All right, I don't have any questions of this witness. Mr. Hamilton.
No questions, Mr. President.
Uh, Since the commissioners didn't have any questions. Yes,
I'm sorry, we were questioning Commissioner Pinochi. Did you already ask that?
I don't. Commissioner Panucci, are you on? I don't believe he's on. Mr. No.
I have one question and I'm going to tell you what my question is. And then be given the sort of changing who can answer what. So my question is, in paragraph 15 of the settlement, are the costs that Mr. Uda was referring to that appear to be ongoing, will they be recoverable under the mechanism that is set out in paragraph 15 of the settlement agreement? Although they aren't specifically identified in there, would those costs be recoverable as envisioned by the parties? So given the fact that we now know that they're being incurred, my question is when and how, and do they anticipate asking for those in paragraph 15 of the settlement?
Are you directing that to Mr. Pancratz?
That's a question I have, and I want, given the rotating nature of the transmission witnesses, somebody ought to be able to answer it. So if it's not Mr. Pancratz, I'd like to be able to ask it of some witness at some point.
All right, Mr. Pancratz, can you answer that question?
No, I'm sorry, I cannot.
All right, it's my understanding we're going to have witnesses on Monday that are the revenue side, correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have a separation between finance witness and operations witness, and these appear to be finance questions directed toward operations witnesses. And so I'd ask that the finance questions be directed to the finance witnesses.
Okay, and can you identify for all the parties here today who you anticipate to be the finance witnesses?
Our chief financial officer, Ms. Lael, and Elaine Rich is the revenue requirement witness, and we have our controller, Jeff Prezine.
Okay. Any additional questions, Mr. No?
I just want to point out in response to that, the operations actually cost money. So to the extent, I don't want to be totally straitjacketed in terms of how our questions are coming out here. We obviously want the right information and the right answers, but it's not like operations don't cost money. So there may be some overlap. Thank you.
So are we finished? We purposely did not permanently excuse Mr. Cashel because we don't want to straitjacket anyone and he is available. But if no one has any questions for Mr. Pancratz, I would like to permanently excuse him.
All right, before we go there, Mr. Uda, did you have any additional questions for this witness?
No, thank you.
All right. Ms. Hill, did you want to redirect on anything?
I do not, thank you.
Okay, so you're renewing your request to permanently excuse this witness. Is there objection to permanently excusing this witness? Seeing none, Mr. Pancratz, thank you for coming today. Thank you for your testimony. You are permanently
you.
excused. You may call your next witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Given the request that was just made, we would recall Michael Cashel to the stand.
All right, Mr. Cashel. Welcome back. You were previously sworn.
Yes, I was.
All right.
Mr. President, this witness is available to answer Mr. Uda's questions.
All right, Mr. Uda.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cashel.
Good afternoon, Mr. Uda.
So I assume you were present. I started down this line of questioning with Mr. Pancratz about the Byron pipeline. Are you the appropriate person to ask questions about the construction and equipment procurement for that pipeline?
Yes, I am.
At all?
That's it.
Okay, well, I guess I have to have it like 1 inch from my face, which is an uncomfortable position to be in. Anyway, so Mr. Cashel, is Northwestern currently engaged in engineering and planning activities for design and procurement of equipment needed to construct the Byron pipeline?
No, we're not, because the line is completed.
Okay, so at this point, that cost has already been incurred. Is that correct?
Yes, the Byron pipeline went into service in late 2022. So it was one of the known and measurable items that went into this rate case under gas transmission assets.
Okay, so would you be the right witness to answer the question of whether or not Northwestern is seeking recovery of those costs in this rate case?
Yes, we are.
Let's see, that one was already answered. I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you, Mr. Cashel.
Ms. Trinnell, can you clarify, did you want to ask questions of this witness?
I think that if they're being, where are they in the stipulation, Mr. Cashel? Do you know?
They're not in the stipulation. The cost of the Byron line,
Right.
not in the stipulation, to my knowledge.
Okay, so you're asking for them in the rate case, but they are not contained within the money that is being asked to be recovered in the stipulation?
So let me be clear on the capital costs associated with the Byron line, which is a gas transmission facility, are in the revenue requirement and the known and measurable portion of the revenue requirement for the gas transmission assets, which is exactly how we would handle the gas pipeline. If it was built essentially to serve the system, any gas transmission facility would. That's why it's in the gas transmission assets. So can you ask another question about the stipulation? And maybe you can answer it.
Well, we're looking at $169 million under the stipulation, 18 of which is on the gas side, 82 on the electric side, and then the other on the PCAM. If those, if the costs for the pipeline are, and I can't imagine that they wouldn't be included in the stipulated.
I'm sorry. I was thinking.
And I asked it poorly.
A different paragraph of the stipulation. So they are in the Byron pipeline costs. And by the way, since it was incurred and put into service late in the year, it's only a portion of the cost, but they are included in the overall revenue requirement. Just as every other asset within gas transmission, electric transmission, distribution, et cetera, are somehow included in that revenue requirement.
Do you know what that number is?
The number for the capital
pipeline.
cost for the Byron pipeline? Yes, I do.
What is it?
It's approximately $30 million. That's not the revenue requirement. That is the plant, the capital cost associated with the plant. And as I also said, and this probably is a question that would be better answered by finance. Since it was put into service late in 2022, only a portion of those overall costs would be in the revenue requirement. But that detail is a better question, probably for Jeff Berzina.
Okay, 30 million is a portion of the total capital costs of the pipeline infrastructure into the gas plant. Yes.
No, not exactly. $30 million roughly is the total cost of the Byron pipeline. Only a portion of that would be in the revenue requirement since it went into service late in 2022.
I think I got it. A portion of the 30 is before the commission now. Some other portion of that 30 may come in later, or will come in later.
At another general rate case.
Okay. And none of that 30 is within the number that has been discussed of 270 for the capital costs of building the gas plant. Is that correct?
That is correct. The Byron pipeline is not included in the costs of the Yellowstone Generating Station. That's because it's a gas transmission asset. And not only does it serve the Yellowstone Generating Station once it's built, but it provides service to the entire Billings area. And what's more, it provides service for our entire east line, which helps us serve all the way into the the Bozeman area market.
And the third component of the gas plant itself, we've got the building of the gas plant, the cost of the pipeline to serve it, and then the actual fuel costs are a third component, which are not part of either the 30 or the 270, correct?
They're certainly not part of the 30. And I don't believe fuel costs are part of the capital cost of, and I don't know if the 270 you're referencing is if that's the plant cost or not. So I can't speak to that, but it's not part of the plant cost. The fuel is not, it's not part of the generation of the gas transmission assets.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't have any more questions.
All right, I'd like to open the opportunity for any party to answer questions of this witness now that he's been recalled. Okay, I don't see any additional questions for this witness. And Northwestern, did you want to redirect, I guess?
Just briefly, if I may, Mr. Cashel, the term plant was used several times. Can we clarify what you mean when you say plant in the context of your testimony?
Was that in regard to the costs?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I'll try to clarify that. What I meant by plant was the capital cost associated with the gas transmission Byron line assets.
And Mr. Cashel, you had indicated that the Byron pipeline went into service in 2022. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And since it's gone into service, has it been serving customers?
Yes, it has.
I think that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair. President.
Okay, shall we temporarily excuse him again?
Yes, please.
All right, Mr. Cashel, you're temporarily excused again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Testimony. All right. Your next witness.
Northwestern would call Miss Glenda Gibson.
All right, Miss Gibson, welcome. Good afternoon, Miss Gibson. Have you been sworn in this manner? All right, would you raise your right hand, please?
There we go.
Okay. Ms. Gibson, do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Okay, your witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Gibson, would you please state and spell your name for the court reporter?
My name is Glenda Gibson, Glenda Gibson.
By whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy,
What is your title
Manager of Regulatory Compliance,
and your business address?
11 East Park Street, Butte, Montana.
Did you file testimony in this docket?
Yes, I did.
You have before you would have been pre-marked as exhibits NWE 5 and 6.
Yes, I do.
I'd note for the record that we provided exhibits 5, NWE 5 and 6 to the court reporter and parties. Is exhibit NWE 5 a true and accurate copy of your pre-filed direct testimony and exhibits?
Yes, it is.
Is exhibit NWE 6 a true and accurate copy of your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do have one correction to my pre-filed direct testimony. On page 9, line 10, the first word of that sentence or that line, qualified, should be changed to certified.
Thank you. And Ms. Gibson, if I were to ask you the same questions today that are in your testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. President, I move to admit NWE 5 into the record.
All right, is there any objection to NWE 5? Seeing none, NWE 5 is admitted.
And Mr. President, I would move to admit NWE 6 into the record as well.
All right, is there objection to NWE 6? Seeing none, NWE 6 is admitted.
With that, I would tender my witness for cross-examination.
Okay. Mr. Brown,
No questions.
Mr. Nelson, Captain Duffy,
No questions, Mr. President.
Mr. Nell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Ms. Gibson.
Good afternoon.
I'm Monica Trinnell and I represent 350 Montana. I just am trying to get a handle on a number for the transmission component that is before the commission in the stipulation, and try to give the commission a working data point. They have the stipulation in front of them to make a decision about. If they don't approve that, then they have to look at the rate case application. So I'm trying to get a sense of, in the stipulation, what is Northwestern asking for transmission expenses in the stipulation? Do you understand my question? And is that something you can answer?
I can give you my understanding. However, Ms. Elaine Rich is actually our witness on the revenue requirement. However, the revenue requirement does separate out transmission and distribution, is my understanding. It does not have a separate revenue requirement for transmission. It is combined transmission and distribution.
Okay, fair enough. If the commission rejects the settlement and is looking at the rate case application to make a determination about what costs it should allow and which it should reject, given that the test year Northwestern has used is 2021, wouldn't it be reasonable to use the transmission revenue credits and costs for 2021 alone? Would you agree with that?
No, I would not.
Why not?
Because of the way the transmission revenues are calculated and the way that there's an interplay between the FERC rates and the Montana rates. The FERC rate is based on a formula rate.
Mr. President, I'm sorry. I don't want to cut you off. I'm looking for a temporal answer, not an explanation of how the allocation works. So my question is really very targeted and narrow. Isn't the correct window of time for the commission to use in assessing the revenues and credits 2021 in a rate case?
I would not agree with that.
Oh, okay. And so then I will ask you why not. Thank you. Why not the narrow temporal window of 2021?
As I was starting to explain, the FERC revenues are based on a formula rate. In the FERC template, the revenues and the rates that go into effect are based on a projection. It's a partially projected template. So the revenues in 2021 were based on a projection. That projection gets trued up in the following year in the template, and any over or under collection gets refunded to the FERC customers. In the 2021 revenues that are reflected in the general ledger, it was based on a 21 projection. Part of that projection is prior year actuals. In 21, the prior projection was using 2020 short-term revenues. There was a significant increase in those revenues in 2021, which then gets trued up in 2022. And we are actually giving back a portion of the revenues that we collected in 2021 through that true up for customers. So that is reflected in the decrease in the revenues in 2022. And that true up refund actually continues through May of 2023. So if you look at a single year of FERC revenues in the general ledger, it may not actually reflect what we have actually kept in revenues from the FERC customers because of the true up and the way those projections and true ups work.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't have any further questions. Thank you, Ms. Gibson.
Thank you.
All right. HRC. Mr. Uda.
Questions, Mr. Chairman?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Uda. Ms. Hornbein,
No questions, Mr. President.
Mr. Helly.
Questions. Thank you.
Okay. Questions from the commission? Vice President Field?
I have no questions, Mr. President, at this time. No
Commissioner-
questions, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Bukacek on the ball. All right, I do have questions for you. Ms. Gibson, let me get out the settlement, please. All right, do you have the proposed settlement in front of you?
I do not.
All right, do you have it now?
Yes.
Okay, could you turn to Exhibit A of the proposed settlement?
Yes.
Are you there? Okay. All right, it's my understanding that Exhibit A shows T&D transmission revenues, correct?
That is correct.
And it's under the heading fixed, quote, fixed excluding property taxes.
Correct.
Okay, so what does Exhibit A show as to the total T&D transmission revenue? Is it 54 million?
Yes.
54 million, 1.47 to be exact?
Mhm.
Okay. All right, staying on the same page. It's my understanding the T&D transmission revenues are under the heading property. So there's a header called property taxes, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the amount listed under property taxes is $15.165 million, correct?
Correct.
All right. So would you agree with the commission that adding $15.165 million, you follow the math with me here,
Mhm.
plus $54.147 million results in a total T&D FERC transmission revenue of $69.3 million?
Correct.
All right. Do you have your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Can you turn to page 10 of your rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Okay. Can you confirm on that document, namely page 10 of your rebuttal testimony, can you confirm that the $69.3 million figure we were just discussing for the FERC transmission revenue is what Northwestern Energy is proposing?
Yes, it is.
And I'd like to confirm with you, it's my understanding Northwestern Energy did not use jurisdictional cost of service study to calculate the transmission revenues. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so back to page 10 of your rebuttal testimony. So the 69.3 million figure we were discussing for the total FERC transmission revenue. It's my understanding that's a 3-year average of 2020 through 2022 actual FERC transmission and distribution revenues. Is that correct?
It's a 3-year average of revenues, actual FERC revenues from FERC jurisdictional customers, not distribution. So it is transmission only.
Okay, transmission only. Thank you for that clarification. Okay. Ms. Gibson, would you agree with the commission that the larger the T&D transmission credit is, that the more the total T&D revenue requirement will be recovered by FERC wholesale customers as opposed to being recovered from Montana retail customers?
I would phrase it slightly differently. I would say that the larger the transmission revenue credit from FERC customers, the lower the amount of transmission recovered from Montana customers. It won't change what we recover from our FERC customers.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Do you have exhibit EAR-3 in front of you? Would that be provided to the witness, please?
I have that.
Okay, could you turn to page 43 of that document, please?
I'm there.
I believe from reading your rebuttal testimony, you referenced this exhibit on page 10 of your rebuttal testimony. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So based on this exhibit and your reference to it, so my understanding that the 2020 FERC transmission revenues were 58 million.
Correct.
Okay, staying on exhibit EAR 3. Right, so in this exhibit and the 2022 FERC transmission revenues. Hold on 1 second, please. Okay, so in this exhibit, 2020 FERC transmission revenues increased by significant amounts, correct? I can give you the figures.
2021 revenues increased significantly. Yes.
Do you know what that number is? Is it 76 million?
It went from approximately 58.4 to approximately 75.8.
Okay. And how about for 2022?
It decreased to approximately 73.8.
All right, then. Mathematically, would you agree with the commission that including the 58 million for 2020 FERC transmission revenues in the 3-year average then significantly reduces the Northwestern proposed T&D FERC transmission proposal?
I would agree that including it in the 3-year average reduces it. I don't believe that that's necessarily incorrect, however.
Okay. I'm showing a number of 69.3 million. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
All right, then mathematically, based on your previous testimony, would you agree that the average of the 76 million, well, the estimated general 76 million 2021 FERC T&D revenue, so this is the average I'm going to ask you about, and the 74 million 2022 FERC T&D revenue is approximately 75 million?
Somewhere between 74, 75 million.
All right, then, based on that testimony, would you agree with the commission that Northwestern Energy's proposal is 6 million below the average of actual FERC T&D transmission revenues for the last 2 years?
I agree it is below the average.
Do you agree that it's 6 million below?
That sounds correct.
All right, based on that testimony, would you agree with the commission then this 6 million difference then becomes the responsibility of Montana retail customers rather than FERC wholesale customers?
I would agree that that $6 million increases the revenue requirement to the Montana customers. However, as I was explaining previously, the FERC formula rate, basically it calculates a revenue requirement for each year. The rates that we put into place are based on projections that then get trued up, and any difference gets refunded or surcharged back to the FERC customers in a following year. In this instance, I agree these numbers do look a little bit odd. And you look at 2020 versus 2021, we're in a transition in that period between the FERC rate case and a final settlement and true up in that FERC rate case, and going forward with projections that are now being trued up in future periods. We filed our FERC rate case in 2019 and settled that case at the end of 2020. Part of the settlement in the FERC rate case was an agreement to do customer-specific refunds for the difference between the interim rates that we had put into place and the final agreed to 2019 and 2020 rates. So 2020 pretty much represents revenues for that period and for the revenue requirement for that period. In 2021, when we did the projection for that period and the rates that went into effect in 2021, it was based on a partial projection. In the FERC template, we project plant assets, asset-related cost depreciation, but we use prior years for certain other operating expenses and short-term revenues. In 2020, what happened is our short-term revenues from FERC customers increased significantly. Don't remember the exact number, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $14 to $16 million. So we over-collected our revenue requirement for that year. So starting in 2022, when we did the true up of 2021, we are giving that back, that over collection. Because the way the FERC template works is you have a revenue requirement, you true up to that actual revenue requirement. So you don't over or under collect, but it takes over time. You do a projection, you do a true up, it goes back. That over collection, I believe in the 2022, when we did the initial true up, we're giving back in the neighborhood of a $10 million over collection.
I'm sorry, what year was that?
In 2022, when we did the true up to 2021,
Okay, thank you.
it resulted in approximately a $10 million over collection that then reduces the 2022 rates. That over collection of 2021 revenues is continuing into 2023. Because even though we do it on a calendar year, the FERC rates go into effect June 1st. So those rates are collected from June 1st through May 31st. We will be filing another true up by the end of April this year to true up the 2022. Which is why I believe that a 3-year average smooths out some of those over collections, give backs, and gets you back to a normal level of FERC revenues.
Okay, that's a perfect stopping point for my next question.
Okay.
Okay, so you recall us talking about the $58 million figure?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so is it my understanding that 58 million figure used for 2020 used the 3-year average? Used in your 3-year average does not reflect the current FERC rates then?
No, it reflected the rates for that year because they get updated every year. But in that time period, because we settled the FERC case and agreed as part of that settlement to do a one-time customer-specific refund of interim rates, those years got cleaned. 2019 and 2020 got cleaned up and didn't have these big over collections that are carrying into future years.
Okay, so just to reiterate what your testimony was, so the 58 million from 2020 did reflect a FERC refund.
Yes, it reflected the fact that we refunded over collections at that point.
Okay, and you may have testified to this, and if you did, I apologize for missing it, but do you recall what the amount of the FERC refund was for that year?
I do not recall.
Subject to check, would you agree that it was roughly 7.8 million? Turn to exhibit ER. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Gibson. Yeah,
Yes, that's what's reflected in the exhibit.
that'd be exhibit ER.
EAR3.
Thank you so much. Okay, based on this line of questioning, and I appreciate your indulgence. Does Northwestern Energy believe that the 58 million figure from 2020 is a better representation of likely future T&D transmission revenues than the 76 million and 74 million booked for the years 2021 and 2022?
It's difficult to predict exactly what the future revenues will be because part of those 2021 revenues, as I stated earlier, were from an increase in short-term revenues. Whether that increased level of short-term revenues sustains in the future, I do not know.
I'm not sure you quite answered my question on that, so I'm going to circle back to it.
Okay.
So my question was the 58 million a better representation of likely future T and D revenues than the 76 million or 74 million?
I think I'd have to answer that I'm not sure any one of those numbers is going to be an exact representation of the future revenues, which is part of why we recommend the 3-year average to reflect that over time, the average revenues have been this level.
So as I understand your testimony, you believe a 3-year average is a better representation, since I use that term, than the 2021 and 22 actual T and D for transmission revenues?
I think it's a reasonable representation of revenues.
So I think I know what the answer is going to be to this next question, but I will ask it. Would Northwestern Energy be willing to use 2021 and the 2021-2022 2-year average for FERC T&D transmission revenues when calculating the rates schedule revenues for the total T&D revenue requirement?
I think we believe that a 3-year average is the appropriate.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, final question. Thank you for your time. Do you have exhibit DED-9 in front of you? This will be the David Dismukes exhibit.
Can we approach the witness?
Yes, of course. Those DED-9, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Have you reviewed this exhibit?
Yes, I have.
Okay. You would agree with me that MCC witness David Dismukes adds an additional 3.6 million transmission losses to his proposed FERC T&D transmission revenues, correct?
Correct.
Do you agree with this adjustment?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, the natural question would be, why not?
I don't agree with the location of the transmission losses. Unfortunately, when we initially filed our revenue requirement, there was an error in the transmission revenues, which Dr. Dismukes picked up in here, where those transmission losses had been left in the T&D transmission revenues. The transmission losses actually run through the PCAM. So it wouldn't be appropriate to include them as a credit against transmission and distribution and as a credit in the PCAM.
Okay, that's my line of questioning for you. Thank you so much. Mr. Hamilton, did you want to do some cleanup? Maybe?
Thank you, Mr. President. I wouldn't call it cleanup, but maybe to pick
I
up.
would.
To pick up where the president left off, you mentioned that the transmission losses are included in the PCAM.
Yes.
Can you point to me where in the PCAM, which FERC account?
My understanding is that it's part of the imbalance that's run through the PCAM.
Okay. Do you have a copy of the red line PCAM tariff in front of you, or can we get a copy of the red line PCAM tariff? Do you have a copy of that in front of you now?
I think I have the current version. We have an exhibit ADD 18, which was submitted with the initial filing.
Very good. And does that red line include a description of which FERC accounts are included in the power costs and credits?
Yes, it does.
And could you identify for me, if you know, if you're the correct witness to answer this question, which FERC account includes the transmission losses?
I'm not sure which FERC account includes the transmission losses.
Do you know if that would be captured somewhere else within the PCAM tariff other than those power cost and credits accounts?
I'm not aware of anywhere else,
Okay.
but I'm not sure.
Do you know who the better witness to answer this line of questions would be?
Elaine Rich would be better to answer the question on the accounting. Joe Steinmetz would be the better person to answer questions on the actual losses running through the PCAM.
Okay. We can set aside the PCAM, fortunately, perhaps for now. You mentioned that there was an increase in the short-term revenues from the FERC jurisdictional customers in 2021. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that was led to between $14 and $16 million overcollection in 2021.
it was about a $14 to $16 million increase in the short-term revenues.
Increase. So what was the overcollection? Do you know?
I can tell you the portion of the overcollection that was in the 2022 true up. The way the true up works is you take the revenue requirement, the projected rates, and we do a true up that says, okay, this is what the actual revenue requirement was, and this is the rate that should have resulted from that actual revenue requirement. And then we calculate month by month an over or under collection by applying the loads for that month times the rates that were in effect, same loads for that month times the rate as they were recalculated as they should have been. And the difference is the over and under collection. The over or under the revenue requirement is calculated on a calendar year basis, but that rate true up is on a June 1 through May 31st basis. So in the 2022 true up, we calculated an overcollection of approximately $10 million. But that overcollection also continues January through May of 2023.
And so as I understand it, it's your testimony that the 2021 actual transmission revenues, which were reflected in Exhibit EAR 3, shouldn't be relied upon because a portion of that had to be refunded.
That's correct.
$10 million of that had to be refunded.
Yes, $10 million is going back into rates.
And so on that same exhibit, when we see the 2022 actual transmission revenues, is it also your testimony that that year suffers from the same problem as 2021?
Yes,
And I suppose at this point, we wouldn't know precisely how much the overcollection is that will need to be repaid as part of 2023.
that's correct. We have not finished that calculation yet.
Would averaging the 2021 and 2022 years resolve, in your mind, that problem of the overcollection, since it would capture the repayment?
No, because it doesn't capture the full repayment because that continues on into 2023.
Okay. Can you describe for me what caused the overcollection of the short-term revenues?
Mike Cashel would be better to answer exactly why. I don't know the full ins and outs of the transmission system. I do know that in that year, our short-term revenues increased.
Okay. All right. That covers all of my questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Trinnell.
Thank you. I have a couple questions following up on those last two lines of questions. Ms. Gibson, would you agree with me that in the stipulation, there isn't a breakout of any of these details that you were just discussing in terms of the which years should be used, which revenues, which credits? That's not reflected anywhere in the stipulation. Would you agree with that?
The total revenue credit is reflected in Exhibit A.
Okay, and if you would look at table 1 at page 4 of the settlement agreement, you have it in front of you, right?
Yes.
Okay, and isn't it true that for the GS2, the large customer group, there is a transmission, the increase there for that group is 0 in this stipulated agreement?
That's what's in the stipulation.
Okay, so if you look at the advocacy of the parties, and I don't know if you have this, excuse me, Mr. President, the staff fact sheet in front of you, but in the staff fact sheet, the parties' positions are set out starting at page 19. Do you want to get a copy of that? I'm not going to ask you a lot of detail about it. I'm going to ask you about it generally.
I would just remind all parties that the staff fact sheet is not a piece of evidence in this matter.
Well, I would like to mark it as 350 Montana Exhibit 29 and move for its admission, Mr. President, if I may.
I'm just going to object on foundation. She can't speak to this exhibit.
That's sustained.
My question is not specifically about the exhibit. It's about the parties' positions. And so I'll ask that question generally.
That would be fun.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Gibson, are you aware of the fact that the large customer group advocated for significantly lower revenue requirement based on transmission than Northwestern's initial application and position?
I'm generally aware that the large customer group advocated for a lower revenue requirement.
And the Consumer Council also advocated for a lower revenue requirement than Northwestern advanced in its initial application.
I'm generally aware of that.
Okay. And if you, if the commission doesn't accept the settlement agreement and proceeds to a hearing and taking all of the evidence of those parties, all of these arguments about which year is the appropriate one, whether it should be a 3-year average, whether it's appropriately 2019 or 2020, that would be all fleshed out, full advocacy, cross-examination of all of those witnesses if the stipulation is rejected, and the commission would be able to get all of that evidence in front of it, right?
I can't specifically speak to the process.
Okay, fair enough. Has Northwestern ever had the commission use a 3-year average in assessing what the appropriate transmission revenues and credits should be?
Yes.
When
We've used in our 2018 rate review, we used a 3-year average of FERC revenues as a revenue credit.
and that was a black box settlement, correct?
I can't specifically speak to that settlement. I know it was a settlement.
Okay, thank you. No further questions, Mr. President.
All right, at this time, we're going to go a little out of order that we've been engaging in this hearing. This was a very substantive line of questioning and answer. So I would like to open it up to all parties to see if any party would like to ask questions of this witness at this time. All right, seeing none. Redirect.
Just one, Mr. President. Just so we're clear, and there was a line of questioning about a 2-year versus a 3-year average. Could you just explain why the 3-year average is a more reasonable approach?
We continue to believe that a 3-year average is a more reasonable approach because of, as I explained, these fluctuations in the overcollections and the refunds that are given back through rates in a subsequent year. We've used a 3-year average in the past. Many of the items within our actual revenue requirement are averages or normalized. So to pick a specific year when we know that we had an overcollection, I think would not be appropriate.
Thank you. That's all I had. I would just ask that this witness be permanently excused.
Okay, is there any objection to this witness being permanently excused? Seeing none, Ms. Gibson, thank you for your testimony today, and you are permanently excused.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, would Northwestern Energy like to call its next witness?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Northwestern would call Lloyd Blaine Nichols, who I believe is on Zoom.
I'm on, Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Nichols. I think we're getting settled here.
Mr. Nichols, have you been sworn?
I have not.
All right. I can't see you, so I'm going to take your word for it, but can you raise your right hand? Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay.
Mr. President, my camera is on. I don't know, maybe a technical issue.
No, we see you now. Thank you. All right.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon, commissioners.
Mr. Nichols, this is Sarah Norcott. Nice to see you. Would you please state your name, spelling your last name and your business address for the record?
Yeah, Lloyd Blaine Nichols, Nichols. The address is 5391 Canyon River Road, Missoula, Montana. I'm self-employed.
And whose behalf are you testifying today?
Northwestern Energy.
And you were previously employed by Northwestern Energy, correct?
That's correct.
And you just mentioned you are now self-employed.
Correct.
Mr. Nichols, did you submit pre-filed direct testimony in this docket?
I did.
And do you have a document that has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWE 13 in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Have you reviewed that document?
Yes, I have.
And is that document a true and correct copy of your pre-filed direct testimony?
It is.
And if I were to ask you here today under oath the same questions that are set forth in Exhibit NWE 13, would your answers be the same except for any changes or modifications?
Yeah, the only change would be my page 1 as far as my employment line 24 and 26. I am now self-employed.
Thank you for that. With that, Mr. President, I would move for the admission of Exhibit NWE 13 as amended.
Is there any objection to admission of NWE 13 as amended? Seeing none, NWE 13 as amended is admitted.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Nichols is available for cross-examination and questioning by the commission.
All right. Thank you, counsel. Mr. Brown? Questions? Mr. Nelson? Captain Duffy?
No questions.
Mr. Nell? Mr. McGraw?
No questions.
Mr. Uda?
No, thank you, Mr. President.
Ms. Warnbein?
No questions.
Mr. Helling?
No questions. Thank you.
All right. Vice President Fielder, do you have any questions for this witness?
I do not.
Commissioner Bukacek?
No questions.
I do not have any questions for this witness. Mr. Hamilton?
No questions.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. That I have no redirect.
Commissioner Pinocci had indicated he might have a question for this witness, is why we didn't put him on the list yesterday.
I would ask that this witness be permanently excused.
All right. Is there any objection to this witness being permanently excused? All right, Mr. Nichols, I'm sorry for having you appear today in person, but you are permanently excused, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right. Witness Carmody up next. Okay.
Chairman Brown, Commissioners, Northwestern call Miss Jean Bold to the stand.
All right. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Have you been sworn?
I have not been sworn.
All right, would you raise your right hand? All right, do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, thank you. You're a witness.
Thank you. Ms. Fold, can you please state and spell your name for the record, please?
Yes, my name is Jean M. Bold, Jeann. Middle initial M, last name Vold.
And by whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
What's your title?
My title is Vice President Technology.
Did you prepare pre-filed testimony in this matter?
Yes, I did.
Do you have what's been marked as Northwestern or NWE 10 in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Is that a true and correct copy of your pre-filed testimony?
Yes, it is.
Do you have any corrections?
I do not.
Chairman Brown, I'd like to move for the admission of NWE 10 in this matter.
Is there any objection to the admission of NWE 10? Seeing none, NWE 10 is admitted.
Chairman Brown, I'd like to tender this witness for cross-examination.
Very good. Mr. Brown,
No questions. Thank you.
Mr. Nelson, Captain Duffy,
No questions. Thank you.
Ms. Trinnell. Mr. McGraw,
No questions.
Mr. Ruda, Ms. Hornbein,
No questions.
Mr. Helling,
No questions. Thank you.
Vice President Fielder,
No questions, Mr. President.
Mr. Bukacek. I don't have any questions for this witness.
No questions.
All right, I'd just like to apologize to the parties. This witness was requested by Commissioner O'Donnell.
Chairman Brown, may we permanently excuse this witness?
You are permanently, well, are there any objections? Seeing none, you are permanently excused. Thank you for appearing today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Can you just give us a minute? We might look through the witness list to see. Let me ask the parties, does anybody want to ask questions of witness Carmody? Would you seek to stipulate to the admission of testimony? Witness Carmody, please.
Yes, Mr. President, Northwestern would, if agreeable to the parties, ask that Mr. Carmody's pre-filed direct testimony be admitted into the record as Exhibit NWE 26.
Is there any objection to NWE 26? Admission of the same? Seeing none, NWE 26 is admitted, and if Mr. Carmody is here, then he can enjoy his afternoon.
Thank you.
And call your next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Northwestern calls John Hines to the stand, please.
Afternoon, Mr. Hines. Okay, thank you. I don't know if you heard that he has been sworn. Oh, you've not. I'm sorry, I misheard. All right, Mr. Hines, would you raise your right hand? Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth? All right, thank you. Your witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Hines.
Good afternoon.
Could you please state and spell your last name for the record?
It's John D as in David Hines, Hines.
And Mr. Hines, who are you employed by?
Northwestern Energy,
And what is your title?
Vice President of Energy Supply, Environment and Government Affairs.
Great. Do you have before you a document that has been marked Northwestern 16?
I do.
Can you please identify for the record what that document is?
It is my pre-filed direct testimony.
And is that a true and accurate copy of your testimony?
I believe it is. Yes,
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do not.
If I were to ask you the questions in your testimony today under oath, would you give the same answers?
I would.
Mr. Chairman, Northwestern would move the admission of Northwestern 16.
Is there objection to the admission of Northwestern Energy 16? Seeing none, Northwestern Energy 16 is admitted.
At this time, Northwestern would tender Mr. Hines for cross-examination.
Okay, before we go there, I suspect we might be spending some time with Mr. Hines. So would the parties be amenable to a 10-minute recess?
Would be great. Thank you.
Okay, the time is now 2:10 p.m. We will take a 10-minute recess and return at 2:20. We will go off the record now.
There, I can just look at my hard copy. It's on page 9. I wasn't gonna say that, but I appreciate you just doing it. That's why. The only time that word gets started is on page 9, at line. Oh. Well, and it's because they're not. Yeah.
All right. Time is now 2:24 PM. We will go back on the record. We did have one request, Thor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, while we were on break, I took a chance to poll the parties regarding the jointly sponsored witness, Mr. David Garrett, who is jointly sponsored by the Montana Consumer Council and the large customer group. I've been informed by all the parties present that no one has any cross-examination for Mr. Garrett. And so if the commissioners do not have any questions, I would ask if it'd be appropriate to make a motion to accept his testimony by stipulation. To refresh the commissioner's recollections, if you don't recall, he's the one who testifies on the issues of depreciation.
Seeing any objection? Do you want to move for the admission then?
If there is no admission, then we would move for the admission of what's been identified as MCC 3, the direct testimony exhibits of David Garrett.
All right. I'll just ask for the objection. Is there any objection to the admission of MCC 3? Seeing none, MCC 3 is admitted, and is he here today?
He is not, and so if we could just excuse him from the hearing, that would be great.
All right, any objection to permanently excusing him? Okay, seeing none, he is permanently excused.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, we were just about to start the cross of Mr. Hines. Mr. Brown?
No questions. Thank you.
Mr. Nelson? Captain Duffy?
No questions. Thank you.
Mr. Trennell?
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, John.
Good afternoon, Monica.
How are you?
Well, I'll tell you afterwards.
All right, fair enough. I would like first to ask you about the new corporate restructuring that you went under. Are you familiar with that?
Only at a very high level.
Okay. If you would look to the chart there to your right, that shows the parent company of Northwestern, which is primarily owned by BlackRock, but there are other investors, correct?
I would just,
Do you know who owns Northwestern? John, I'll
Mr.
rephrase my question. I'll withdraw and rephrase. Do you know who owns Northwestern?
there's a multitude of funds that own Northwestern. There is no one individual or several individuals or companies or funds.
Okay. Do you agree with Mr. Bird that BlackRock is your single largest investor?
Subject to check, I would.
Okay. And do you agree that the restructuring docket removes the ring fencing protections that were put in place in the bankruptcy at the early part of this century?
Ms. Trennell, I'm not qualified to speak to the pieces of the holding company filing.
Who is?
I would defer to legal.
Well, and I would object to this line of questioning. The holdco docket was its own, or the corporate restructuring was its own separate docket with a settlement and now a final order. It's not part of the rate review.
Mr. Nell, did you want to address that objection?
I do, Mr. President, and I think this is actually a really important piece because right in front of the commission now is $169 million request for a rate increase, which is historic. And a week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a restructuring docket was approved subject to follow-on process. What that restructuring docket does is leave the Montana ratepayers holding all the debt exposed to enormous liability with all the profit from this docket flowing to the New York shareholders. That's information the commission has to have in front of it as it decides how to proceed here.
I would object to that entire monologue. First of all, Ms. Trennell and her client didn't bother to even participate in that docket, let alone now pontificate about it when it is soundly not part of this docket.
So I'm going to sustain the objection. Mr. Nell,
Mr. President, my question was, is there a witness from Northwestern who is capable of answering questions about the restructuring process. And if I need to make a relevance link in asking those questions, fair enough. But I think somebody from Northwestern should be prepared to speak about the impact of that on this rate case.
I would suggest that the main witness from that docket, Ms. Lael, would be qualified to speak to it. I
Thank
would
you.
continue to object that it is not part of this docket.
Thank you, Mr. President. I can move on. Thank you, John. Northwestern has a procurement plan that it files with the commission, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and the most recent procurement plan, or the one that's in operation now, is the 2019 plan. Is that correct?
With the 2020 supplement.
Okay, I'm going to hand you some pages from that procurement plan, which is docket number in 2018-1178. And I would ask that the commission take administrative notice of the 2019 electricity supply resource procurement plan with the supplement in this docket.
We don't object to that.
Commission takes notice.
I would
Thank you.
I would add, though, that the witness identified that there was a 2020 supplement that the commission should likewise take notice of.
That was part of my request.
All right, very good.
Thank you.
Noted. Accepted.
Thank you. So John, I've handed you some pages from the 2019 plan as they pertain to carbon and the costs of carbon. So let's talk about the gas plant in Laurel. When you were planning that plant, did you factor in costs of carbon emissions from the plant when you were determining whether or not to add that as a resource to Northwestern's portfolio?
Mr. Chairman, I would object to that question because clearly there's no part of the plant that is part of this rate review.
I'm going to overrule. Go ahead, Mr. Nell.
Thank you, John.
So I would change the question to be when we were making plans for what resources were most cost effective in this plan. It's not that we were planning for the Yellowstone plant at that point in time. So just that would be how I think a proper phrasing of the question. I'm sorry, Monica, I've kind of forgot the rest of the question.
Okay, so you're in charge of planning what the generation is for Northwestern.
That is correct.
And you've been in that role for 2 decades?
No, well, I guess it is getting to be that long. Yes, 18, 17 years.
Okay. And so you were responsible for the decision to include the gas plant in Northwestern's supply portfolio, right?
No, I would phrase it as that I was responsible for overseeing the plan. The modeling is what dictated what was included in the final preferred resources in the 2019 plan.
Okay. And you and as part of looking at all of that and the modeling, were the costs of carbon emissions considered in the modeling when you were reaching that decision?
There was, I believe, a couple of different approaches that we took to look at scenarios that did include non-carbon emitting resources. One scenario was where it was I believe, subject to check all renewable, which would implicitly show the cost of pursuing a non-carbon approach. And then I believe there was some sensitivities run on carbon pricing as well.
Okay. And when you ran those sensitivities on carbon pricing, did you have specific calculations for the carbon that will be attributable to the plant in Laurel?
Again, we did not model the Laurel plant.
I'm sorry, I'm a little.
Procurement plan. Laurel plant was not modeled specifically in the procurement plan. What came out of the procurement plan was preferred resources, and more specifically, resources that could fit the need that was identified in the plan. I'm sorry. And so the plan itself sets forth a framework by which we then issued a competitive solicitation process. That competitive solicitation process, administered by a third-party entity, is what eventually selected the gas plant, a storage facility, as well as a power purchase arrangement. So just to make it clear, Northwestern never chose upfront that the Yellowstone plant was going to be a resource that was going to be included in the plant. Rather, the modeling indicated that the characteristics of a gas plant, a specific rice type of gas plant, which can be quickly turned on and off, was the type of preferred resource that was most advantageous for our customers.
Okay, so do I have it correct then that once you had that that result, if you will, from the procurement plan, if that's what I think you just said, that you didn't do an independent cost analysis of the Laurel plant itself on a standalone basis? Do I have that right?
Again, at that point in time, there was not a project, the Yellowstone plant, in the 2019 plan.
Okay. Okay, I got that.
So we could not have modeled the plant at that point in time as part of the plan.
Okay, so there, to be super clear, there exists no financial modeling of the impact of the cost of building, constructing, and operating the Laurel gas plant. That doesn't exist.
Again, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to object to this line of questioning. And if we could at least put a standing objection, there's going to be an entire prudence review in a future docket. Getting into this minutia isn't helping this docket.
Right, I'm going to overrule your objection. So let's be clear where we're at in this hearing. We have a proposed settlement that if a commission does not adopt, then we do have the reliability rider back in front of the commission. As I find this line of questioning is relevant to that possible outcome, I will note your standing objection. I would like you to allow Ms. Trinnell to move forward with her questioning, please.
Can I just very briefly respond to that? Even in the rate review, even if there is no settlement, the reliability rider calls for a prudence review in a future docket. So that just
you can, Ms. Heim, this is your witness. You have the right to redirect your witness to make that point if you want. This is Ms. Trinnell's time to ask these questions. All right, would you let her proceed, please?
Thank you.
Ms. Trinnell.
Thank you, Mr. President. John, do you remember my question?
I do.
Okay, thank you.
So once the resources were bid in, again, it was an all source competitive solicitation. So basically what that means is we asked for any type of resource that could meet the needs that were identified in our procurement plan. Our needs were capacity, and most importantly, capacity that extended beyond a short-term duration. So we asked for 20-hour duration resources. In other words, something that you could turn on for 20 hours or more that would be available. We also asked for 10-hour and 5-hour. Each of those different categories or buckets, if you will, could have different types of resources to comply with that. So when the resources were bid in, our independent analysis and entity analyzed each of those resources to see which would come up with the lowest cost portfolio. At that point in time, the Yellowstone generation plant was part of the analysis. It was modeled, and I believe there was a sensitivity on carbon that was part of that analysis.
Okay, and my question really, John, is there any financial analysis of the costs of building, operating, running, and owning the gas plant and the impact for Montanans? Is there a standalone financial analysis of what that would cost the utility and how much it's going to cost through the years? Does that exist?
I believe I've answered that, but maybe I'm not being
Well-
clear. I apologize.
What I heard you say is no, because I didn't hear a yes that exists. I heard there was a modeling, there were some sensitivities about carbon, but there isn't any spreadsheet that I could look at that you could show me that would say the construction costs are X, the operation costs are Y, the fuel costs are another number. That Excel spreadsheet exists or it doesn't?
It does exist, and it is part of the modeling analyses that were conducted by our independent bid evaluator. And that is expected, not expected, it will be part of the justification of this resource at the appropriate time.
Okay, thank you. In that spreadsheet that you just said exists, is there any calculation for carbon, the costs of carbon emissions?
There was a sensitivity, I believe, again, subject to check. I don't have this in front of me right now. I believe there was a sensitivity analysis run, but to be clear to the commission, Northwestern is prohibited by Montana statute from including carbon as a benefit to a non-carbon emitting entity or as a premium onto a carbon emitting entity. So
Okay, I'm
We're not
gonna
able to
ask
justify-
you to stop and I'm gonna move to strike. This isn't about why or why not they did it. They can put whatever legal arguments and defenses about their actions. I'm trying to get to the evidentiary questions of did they do it or didn't they do it?
All right. Mr. Nell, I'm gonna deny your motion to strike. The witness did provide an answer to your question. If you believe he didn't answer the question that you asked, you certainly have the right now to re-ask him a question that
Okay, thank
seeks to
you.
get the answer you would like.
Thank you, Mr. President. John, the question, I think I heard you say you didn't include the cost of carbon emissions in the Excel spreadsheet that you have that addresses the financial impacts and costs of this plant. Is that right?
To be very clear, Monica, I said subject to check. I believe we did. I'm sorry. Blue LaFave, who's coming a witness right after me, is the individual in charge of that aspect of our supply portion, and he can be more definitive than I am on this, and I apologize.
Okay, great. So if there is a spreadsheet and if carbon is included in that as a component of the cost of this plant, we should know somewhere what that number is, right?
Again, I would say my understanding of what we're asking for in this docket is that there is no request for capital recovery, and that is at a subsequent process where the resource will be fully vetted by the commission and interveners and to test all of the assumptions that were not made.
Is it your understanding in the stipulation that you're asking that the commission allow O&M costs immediately when this plant goes into service?
My understanding of the stipulation is that Northwestern would still need to do a filing before the commission before variable costs and or fixed O&M or any other types of costs would be allowed into rate base or into rates, excuse me.
That filing to be to prudency review?
That's my understanding of how the language is in the stipulation. Yes.
Great, thank you. And I gave you a copy of the 2019 procurement plan, and there is a page there that has a table of high and low carbon assumptions, which is it's page 9-13 of the 2019 procurement plan. Do you have that in front of you?
I'm sorry, 9-1.
The table is 9-1, correct? And the bottom.
Page 9. Yep, I have it. Thank you.
And so that table sets out forecasts of CO2 prices with a one is CO2 prices, and then the next columns are high prices. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. Did Northwestern factor in these CO2 prices when they made when you made the decision to build this plant?
No, we didn't. I can't say whether we modeled it. Again, I deferred that to Blue Lefebvre. I can tell you that we could not use carbon as a justification for this resource not being included or for another resource to be included per Montana statute.
Okay, so the answer is no, you didn't. Is that
No, I said subject to check. I believe we did. But you'll have to refer to Blue Lefebvre, who has more in-depth knowledge on the solicitation and analysis.
okay? Now I'm really confused. The question is, did Northwestern use these forecasts of CO2 prices in figuring out the costs of the gas plant?
My apologies. I thought you asked, did Northwestern use CO2 prices? I don't know if they use these particular prices or not.
Okay. And when you acquired the hydros in 2014, it was Northwestern's position at that time that carbon costs were an appropriate calculation to factor in assessing the acquisition of any resource, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to object again, but similar to the same objection I had yesterday to the same line of questioning that was sustained, we would object. The hydros are not part of the rate review.
Ms. Trinnell, I'm having a hard time tracking what the relevance of the 2014 purchase of the hydros has to do with this rate case.
If the president will allow me about 2 questions on this, hopefully I will get to the point.
All right, I'm gonna, Ms. Heim, I'm going to rule your objection. Ms. Trinnell, please
Thank
try to
you.
make the questions relevant.
Well, okay, I'm trying to do this through the witness and not my argument. So
Agreed.
thank you. John, in the 2014 hydro docket, isn't it true that the commission awarded an acquisition adjustment of $247 million attributable to the cost of carbon emissions? Is that accurate?
I do not know that number.
And actually,
Okay.
admonish the witness to wait for the objection. But I would object to any more questions on this line. They're outside the scope.
Mr. President, well,
I'm sorry.
my line of questions is directed to the fact that there is a carbon cost in our rates that we pay right now for a non-carbon emitting resource. That carbon emission has never come to pass. 350 Montana would like to make a request that this commission take that $247 million and subtract it from the cost of this gas plant. If you will allow me to, put the evidence in the record.
And Mr. Chairman, we would object strenuously. The entire monologue by Ms. Trinnell assumes facts not in evidence is far beyond the scope of this docket.
I'm going to sustain that objection, Ms. Trinnell.
Mr. President, will you allow me to ask this witness questions about whether or not there was a carbon? Well, I think we already crossed that. There was a carbon emission cost in the hydro docket. We've established that. So I want, to ask what the amount was, and then I will move on.
I would say that actually misstates and mischaracterizes the witness's testimony.
I would agree with Ms. Heim on that as well.
May I ask the witness the questions?
Ms. Heim, I know your standing objection. Ms. Trinnell, please proceed.
John,
Context here.
was there a carbon emission cost that was factored into the final decision that the commission made in the hydro docket?
My recollection is that per the commission rules, we did include a carbon valuation in the hydro docket.
Okay. Do you remember roughly what that valuation was?
As I recall, and I don't remember the specific number, but we have done analyses. At that point in time, we only looked at energy. Well, there was different ways to evaluate the hydro docket. And one of them was certainly purchase price and what the seller was willing to offer the resources for. Another way to do it, though, was at that point in time, we didn't have the sophistication to understand that capacity was a necessary and should be valued piece of the value of a resource. You know, we do that now in a variety of different proceedings. QFs, we have a capacity component, we have an energy component. At that point in time, we only did energy as far as our analysis. So we did energy plus some computation for the carbon. What we have done a very high level analysis that shows if we had have used the capacity component of the hydro system for as part of the valuation and taken out all of the carbon analysis, the value of the hydro assets would have actually been substantially higher than what we ended up putting into rate base.
Mr. President, given the fact that the witness just opened the door with respect to how the hydros were valued and defending the total cost that was put into rate base by the commission in 2014, I think that I am allowed to inquire of this witness what the components were now that he has testified that he thinks that they're defensible on other grounds.
Are you asking to ask more questions?
I am.
Please proceed until
Thank
we have an
you.
objection.
Well,
Okay, thank you.
I would insert an objection. I think this line of questioning is far outside the scope of this docket, and 350 Montana has offered no motion, no testimony, nothing to support this discussion of hydro acquisition cost. It's part of the commission's final orders. It's not open for debate in this docket.
I'm going to overrule. I'm going to give you some lead on this, Mr. Nell.
Thank you. So, Mr. Hines, my question is, do you remember whether or not there was a carbon value assigned to the hydros in the hydro acquisition docket?
There was.
Okay. And do you remember what it was?
I do not.
Okay. I'd like to, I took your deposition in another case, didn't I?
Yes, you have.
And I asked you that question. Do you remember whether or not the carbon value assigned to the hydros didn't, and you answered that question in that docket, didn't you?
I can't remember.
Okay, let me ask it this way. In your deposition, you were under oath, weren't you?
Yes.
And all the answers you gave were truthful, weren't they?
Yes.
Okay. And so I asked you that question, what was the value? And you answered, I think levelized over the life, it was somewhere in the $5 to $10 range. Do you have any reason to dispute your earlier testimony here today?
I would ask that Ms. Trinnell put that transcript in front of the witness if she's going to question him about it.
Certainly.
Absolutely agree with that, Ms. Chanel.
Council would also like a copy.
I can email a copy.
All right. So before
And
Northwestern Energy Council is certainly entitled to see what you're putting in front of the witness. So we are going to take an 8-minute recess. Please provide, Mr. Nell, please provide, frankly, everybody who is a party to this case, what you're going to be questioning the witness about. Time is 2:54.
Oh, Mr. President, I will note for the record, it has been submitted as 350 Montana Exhibit 18. So it isn't.
That exhibit has not been admitted into evidence.
To the point everyone has it. It was submitted prior to the hearing, prior to it being started.
It was attached to the witness she withdrew, so I don't have it in front of me.
So I'm going to go back to where I was, asking you to provide whatever it is you're going to provide, Mr. Hines, to all the parties and the commission. Times 254, we'll go off the record. Mr. Nell, have you provided the document to the parties? All right, the time is now 3:04 PM. We will go back on the record. Mr. Nell, did you want to note for the record that you provided this document to the parties, please?
350 Montana Exhibit 16 is the deposition of John Hines that has been provided to all of the parties previously and by email and is publicly available on the commission's website.
All right, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. John, before we broke just now, the question that I asked you was whether or not you remembered what the levelized price of the assigned to carbon in the hydro docket was. That was my question. Do you remember that question?
Yeah, I remember the question.
And do you know the answer?
Could I see my response? That'll help inform me of.
Yes, happy to put this exhibit 350 Montana, exhibit 16, page 55 of Mr. Hines's previous deposition, lines 6 to 13 in front of the witness, if I may, Mr. President.
You may approach.
And Mr. Hines, you answered the question of what the value assigned to the carbon was in the deposition. What is your answer?
I'll just read it here. Do I remember whether there was a carbon value? There was. Do you remember what that was? And I answered, I think levelized over the life of and I didn't complete the sentence, somewhere in the $5 to $10 range. And you asked me per megawatt, and I said no, per megawatt hour.
Okay, thank you. So backing up a little bit, Mr. Hines, to rate base. Let's just talk about what rate base is for a minute, if you will.
I have limited knowledge on the actually rate making mechanism, but I'll give you my limited knowledge.
Okay, well, as the person in charge of supply, you should know what resources are in your portfolio that are a component of your rate base, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So Northwestern's rate base, generally, for generation, you break it out for generation from Colstrip and all other resources, correct?
The only thing I'd add to that, Mr. Nell, is that we also include not only the resources, but also any investment in those resources thereafter.
Great. Capital expenses, maintenance, all that good stuff.
We don't include maintenance into rate base, but
okay,
typically anything under the definition of capital.
Okay. And the rate base for purposes of your proposed rate base for purposes of this docket for generation, excluding Colstrip, is just under $950 million. Does that sound about right to you?
I am not aware of that number. In this docket, I supplied just overall testimony from a direction of our supply portfolio. Our finance people who will be coming next week have the specific numbers.
Okay. And the hydros are a part of the rate base of Northwestern's rate base, are they not?
They are correct. That's correct.
And we're still paying on those, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Okay. So to the extent that Northwestern is making a request for an increase in the rates that we all pay and asking the commission to approve that, would you agree with me that all of the assets that make up the rate base are relevant to this commission's analysis of how they set our rates?
Could you rephrase that? I didn't track your question.
Mr. Brown, I'll withdraw and move on. Mr. President, I'm sorry. Thank you. We'll move on. So going back to the hydros and carbon, the value that was assigned to the hydros for carbon was predicated on the argument or the position that there would be a carbon tax imposed by the federal government, correct?
I can't speak to the specificity of the basis for the analysis. I'd have to go through that docket again to refresh my memory. There was part of the overall analysis, an assumption of carbon value being part of the asset to justify a cost that was paid.
Okay. And no carbon regulation ever came to pass, did it?
That is correct.
Okay. So
Although I do need to modify that, they're not at the federal level, but the state of Washington, for example, and the state of California do have carbon assessments for resources now being sold into those states. So you're correct as far as your assumption on a federal level, but certainly on resale value of power sales into those jurisdictions, that's incorrect.
okay, but so as far as Montana, that no carbon regulation has ever come to pass from the state of Montana, has it?
I would agree with that. In fact, there's a prohibition of assessment of carbon at this point in time,
Okay.
of inclusion of carbon.
Well, would you agree with me that we should have a hearing to assess whether the payment that we're making based on carbon is even legal? Should we reopen the hydro docket to see that?
I would
Mr.
object.
Hines?
I would object to the form of the question. It assumes facts not in evidence and misstates his testimony.
His testimony was that it's not legal.
I think the question here is, would he agree to open up a new docket to analyze this? Is that, can you restate the question?
Yes, based on your testimony that.
Mr. Hines, I think you're fully qualified to answer that question.
Absolutely not. This resource was analyzed in the context of the circumstances at that point in time. Testimony by all interested parties was provided at that point in time. The commission made a decision to include the hydro docket into rate base, the hydro resources into rate base, and to revisit it at this point in time seems to be a very backwards way of approaching this resource. That's frankly.
Fair enough. You've made your point. Thank you, John. But the fact of the matter is that as we sit here today, there's would you agree with me that $169 million is a lot of money?
Absolutely.
So the commission's being asked to decide whether or not they should put that much money onto Montana ratepayers. And in making that decision, don't you think it's fair for the commission to assess all of what Northwestern has in its portfolio, the rates that we're paying now, and whether they're just and reasonable? Don't you think that's fair?
I believe the way resources once put into rate base, so as long as they're used and useful and prudently employed, that is the decisions for the commission.
And the Northwestern has made the decision to build a gas plant, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And at some point, you'll seek recovery for the costs of that before this commission, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And do you know roughly what that number will be? Rough numbers?
Rough number, from a capital perspective, we expect to see around $270 million for a 175 megawatt plant.
And that doesn't include, did you hear Mr. Cashell's testimony that the Byron pipeline is, that's exclusive of the cost for the pipeline to feed the gas plant?
I believe that Mr. Cashell's testimony was that the Byron pipeline, which came into service in 2022, is being used to serve our core gas customers' needs at this point in time.
Right, and that it was, as I understood, it was about 30 million. Some portion of that is before the commission in this case, and some portion of that will come in at a later time. Did you understand that?
That is correct.
Okay, so 270 plus some portion of the cost of the Byron pipeline plus fuel costs, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And that's in addition to and above and beyond the 169 million that the commission is looking at in this case, right?
Yes, that's a separate process, which we'll come to the commission for to ask for it to be vetted and decided upon by the commission.
Any rough guess as to timeline for when you're going to come back for that ask?
We haven't made that decision yet. Obviously, we'll be balancing the needs of recovering some of those costs once it's in operation, because we will be spending money on behalf of our customers without recovering any of those rates versus appropriate timing when we do it. And that'll be a decision made by Northwestern Legal, Northwestern Regulatory.
John, you just testified that you'll be spending money before recovery of rates. Isn't it true that prior to 2007, that was the only way that the utility actually acquired resources?
I would answer it that there was a period between roughly around 2002 and 2007 when that is the case. Prior to 2002, that was not the approach. In fact, that was at the Montana Power Company era. I wasn't there, but my understanding is that they were recovering a resource portfolio that basically encompassed all of their need. So they had much more into rate base on a megawatt hour basis for serving their customers than where Northwestern is now.
You're aware of the fact that Colstrip Unit 4 was never in rate base prior to 2008, correct?
That is correct.
And just for clarification, the commission doesn't have to approve and put that plan into rate base, does it?
I would just ask for clarification of what plan Ms. Trinnell is referring to.
We're talking about the gas plant, John and Laurel. The commission doesn't have to approve that plan and put it in rate base, the gas plant in Laurel, and put it in rate
The
base.
commission has discretion as to determine after the evidence is presented to it is whether it's a used and useful plant, and it's being posed under I think in the settlement, it used the term prudency standard, but from our perspective, it's no different than any other application we'd use either for pre-approval or for putting a resource in a general rate case application. So you're correct. They do have that discretion. We would expect that our case would convince the commission to put it in a rate base.
Thank you. And the hydros, what is the total megawatts of the hydros?
I believe when we purchased the hydros and we subtracted out the KER, it was around 460 megawatts at that point in time. Since then, we've made investments in the hydro facilities very low cost investments that increase the efficiency at the plants, and we're somewhere around 490 megawatts at this point in time.
And has the drought had a negative impact on the production of the hydros?
Over the course since we bought the resources and put them on to into the portfolio, we've had some drought years. We've had some very surplus power years. My staff ran an analysis just the other day that showed we're around 99.5% of what was estimated in our hydro docket. So I'm quite comfortable that while there has been negative years, it's also been very much consistent with what we assumed in our modeling for the resource.
Okay, thank you. There was a fire in the town of Denton. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
Are the costs of dealing with that fire part of the Northwestern's request in this docket? Do you know?
That's not part of my domain.
Oh, okay. Can you tell me who might know that answer to that?
I'm looking at legal.
For what it's worth, I believe Elaine Rich is probably the right witness for that.
And the I was going to say the failure, but the outage, the Hebgen Dam incident, is Northwestern seeking? Are you familiar with that incident?
I am.
Are you seeking the cost of the repair of that in this docket?
I would defer the cost question to our finance people.
Okay. Would you agree with me that we are in a time of changing resources and changing climate?
I'll part your questions out into two distinct questions. I believe at this point in time, there is a movement towards different type of generation portfolio. I believe Northwestern is well situated to be part of that change if it actually occurs. I also believe that our portfolio is being moved more and more to become a reliable and affordable portfolio, while recognizing the potential change of the portfolio through federal or state policies over time.
Does Northwestern factor in climate change in planning its generation portfolio?
We recognize through carbon as a surrogate and do sensitivity analyses with that as one potential issue. We factor in a lot of environmental issues. We factor in a lot of other types of cost variations. So is carbon our main driver for deciding portfolios? I'd say absolutely not. Go back to my primary concerns being in charge of the supply portfolio is, one, being compliant with all existing state laws and federal laws. Two, ensuring that we are able to do what we can to have affordable power supply for our customers and reliable power supply for our customers. And right at this point in time, given what I would say the concerns about reliability, those are elevated to a higher level, whether it's energy independence or having a greater control of being not aligned to very high market prices. That's where we're trying to adjust our portfolio. We do have a net zero plan that's out there, but if you even read the language associated with that, first of all, it's 2050, excuse me. Second, we are very clear that certain things have to take effect, including technological change, cost changes, in order for us to get to that goal. If those don't come about, then it's going to be a much more difficult effort for us to achieve.
Thank you, John. Will the Laurel gas plant contribute to climate change?
The Laurel gas plant will emit carbon around 290,000 tons per year.
And will that contribute to climate change?
I'm not sophisticated enough to say that there is an absolute that it will contribute to climate change. When I look at the contribution of the Yellowstone plants to the contribution of even the area of Billings, I believe. So we're talking about 290,000 tons of carbon emitted from Yellowstone. We reduced the amount of carbon in that area, not we Northwestern, but this events in Montana by almost 6 million tons of carbon. So you look at net, we've had almost a 5.7 million ton reduction just in the last 6 or 8 years. So if you're looking at it from just a Montana perspective, I would say our state is better off now than we were 10 years ago from a carbon perspective. I'd also say that you take those numbers. My understanding of climate modeling is that you take those numbers, it's a worldwide effect. And so you have to start looking at what's 290,000 tons of carbon to worldwide effects. And you see it's about 7 or 8 or 9 decimal points of an impact. Even I saw.
Thank you, John. Can we move on to the next question?
I'm going to allow this witness to continue.
Oh, that's fine.
You
That's
asked him
fine.
the question.
Yeah,
You may continue your answer.
certainly. Go ahead, John.
I'll just add one more point. And I was just saying that I read an article just the other day about the incremental amounts of carbon being emitted by China and India are around 750 million tons more carbon than the entire US fleet of coal plants. So when you ask me, does a 290,000 ton emittance contribute to global climate change? I can't honestly say it does. Statistically, numerically, I don't think you can make that linkage.
Okay. And would it be fair to say that Northwestern's supply planning is based on those statements that you made in your capacity for Northwestern? That's not your personal belief?
No, we do planning based upon statute, procurement rules, planning rules that the commission has in place. And we also conduct numerous sensitivities on a variety of risks, including what carbon could do or couldn't do to the pricing of electricity.
Okay. The Hardin plant is running is it operating on coal for a crypto facility? Do you know?
The Hardin plant isn't part of our portfolio, so I'm not aware of how it's operated or what it's being operated for.
Okay, well, you just said that there was a reduction of the carbon emissions in the Billings area.
I did.
Okay, and so as a fair follow-up to that, I wanted to ask you if you're aware of the fact that the Hardin plant has been supporting a crypto mine using coal.
To be more specific, to help you understand where my statement came from, the retirement of the coal plant or the Corrette plant and the retirement of coal strip units 1 and 2 have led to that decrease in carbon emissions.
Okay. And then coming back to the question that I asked you, I asked you in your deposition, I asked you the question, will the Laurel gas plant contribute to climate change? And I would like you to read your answer into the record here, and I'll hand this to you. It's at 350 Montana Exhibit 16, page 66, lines 21 to 24. And if you would, John, read the question and your answer then, please.
So the question Monica asked was, will the Laurel gas plant contribute to climate change? My response was, it will contribute carbon, which has been linked to climate change.
Thank you, John. Switching gears a little bit, Mr. Hines, in assessing your resource needs and your planning and generation, has Northwestern pursued long-term contracts with what you called the KER, also now known as the Salish-Kasanke Calypso hydroelectric facility? Has Northwestern pursued long-term capacity contracts with that hydroelectric facility?
For long-term contracts, we typically employ a competitive solicitation specifically for contracts, not as broad as what I talked about for the resource acquisitions from the 2019 plan. And Kerr had, to my knowledge, has been notified of these solicitations. Obviously, we would be happy to receive a bid from them if they would be so inclined. But to my knowledge, and I would defer for complete acknowledgement of this statement to Joe Steinmetz, I don't believe they have, I know they have not bid in a low cost product, a cost product compared to others.
Oh, okay. So it's not that they haven't bid in, it's that the price, the cost was not one that was acceptable to Northwestern.
I'm just gonna, just caution the witness that I don't know if this is true, but often those proceedings are governed by an NDA. So I just want to be cautious not to get too far into the details if that's the case.
And I was just going to say, I don't know if they bid in or not.
Okay. Are you aware of the fact that PG&E has a 15-year contract for 45 megawatts from the SQC hydroelectric facility?
I am generally aware that they have done that transaction, yes.
Okay. And the kelp, you're familiar with kelp?
I am.
Okay. And you're aware that that's about 41 megawatts?
I always get the two mixed up. It's around 85 average megawatts from the combination of BGI and kelp.
Yeah, Yelp is about 65 and kelp is about 40. Does that sound right?
35, I would say, is closer to it, but
Okay.
we're arguing potatoes.
That's not the thrust of my question. So my question is, that's up for renewal next year. Will Northwestern renew that contract with kelp?
I would maybe just assert that that is the subject of an open docket in front of the commission and not appropriate to ask the witness questions about.
If you wouldn't have made that objection, I would have overridden it. That is not material for this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate that. The context for my question is that in this docket, there are costs related to the gas plant. We know that additional costs will be coming, and I think it's a fair question for the commission to assess and consider what other resources were potentially out there. So I will move on.
My ruling stands, Mr. Nell.
I understand. Thank you. Generally, John, if resources are available on Northwestern's system, that would generally be a lower cost resource than bringing resources in from out of state. Would you agree with that?
I would define the question a little bit differently, that resources in Montana typically have a pricing advantage because you're not including transmission as part of the total transaction costs.
Okay.
But to say just because they're located in Montana, no, that doesn't give them a pricing benefit.
Okay. We won't go down that rabbit hole. I'll move on to my next question, which is, there was a recent decision about Broadview Solar from FERC. Are you generally familiar with that?
No, I mean, I know FERC came out with a decision, but that's about all I know about it.
And that's enough for my question, which is, Northwestern has challenged a number of these resources. Are the legal fees for those challenges in this docket for recovery from the ratepayers of Montana?
I do not know.
Who would?
I would again point probably either to Ms. Rich or Mr. Berzine. Yeah, it would be, I'm sorry, it'd be Ms. Rich if it's rate base.
Thank you. John, Northwestern does a fair amount of advertising and does significant advertising about its clean energy portfolio. Who pays for that advertising?
And that's not part of the supply obligation, so I'd have to defer to another witness.
Ms. Rich, I
Nope,
assume.
that would be Vice President Bobby Schrappel.
Why does a monopoly utility advertise?
Northwestern, everything Northwestern does is designed to enhance our customers' knowledge of programs available, to inform them of, I think, real information of what our portfolio is made of. For example, there's a misunderstanding cultivated by certain groups that seem to portray Northwestern as being a Luddite or extremely dirty utility. I don't think it's good for our customers to have an unbalanced approach to receiving this information. Certainly, I believe our portfolio is one of a very good portfolio, given the situation that we are in, especially coming out of the deregulation era, and we continue to strive. That's one example why I think it's beneficial for our customers to actually understand how we believe our portfolio is compared to others. We also talk about our capacity deficiency, and that helps people understand why we're going out and acquiring additional generation in order to better serve our customers' needs.
So if I understood your answer correctly, I think what I heard you say was you think it's important that your customers see Northwestern in the same light that management sees it. Fair?
I object. That mischaracterizes his.
Ms. Rhines, you can answer that question.
I believe that our advertising informs customers in a manner that provides the facts and allows them to basically draw their own conclusions.
Do you invite customers into those conversations about what the ad should say?
We have numerous stakeholder groups where we invite different parties around the state to be part of a discussion, whether it is on transmission. For example, Mr. Cashel did a fairly extensive stakeholder involvement on the development of a substation up at Big Sky. My group, the piece that I oversee, our group has been doing fairly significant stakeholder involvement on how we're going to operate the Hebgen Dam and have people understand both the pros and cons of different types of operation. You know, we only have a finite amount of water, and you have to meet fish issues, temperature, water volume. You have to meet sufficient power. You can't dewater the reservoir, but you also have to ensure that you have adequate flood control. So we invite people into that process. Those are just two examples of the type of process.
Thank you, Mr. Hines. It does seem to me a pretty different thing to be telling people operational details about the lowering of Hebgen Dam, and your view, as I heard you say it, that Northwestern isn't to correct as you see it, a misperception that Northwestern is a dirty utility. Spending money on those two things seems like a very different set of expenditures.
I would once again rephrase your characterization. All we're doing is providing the customers the fact if we have X amount of carbon-free generation, that's what we have. I don't think that's just trying to create a message that's based upon incorrect facts.
How much carbon-free generation has Northwestern Energy built? Not acquired, but built. How much carbon-free generation has Northwestern Energy built since it's been in Montana?
I think our main resource that we have built that's carbon-free is our Spy-on-Cop wind plant. It's around 40 megawatts. The amount that's in our portfolio that we've acquired on behalf of our customers is closer to 1,000 megawatts.
And that was already existing generation, mainly the hydros, correct?
That's correct. I'm not sure of the distinction. It's still serving our customers.
Right, but the distinction that I would make is what was the book value of the hydros when you acquired them?
I'm not sure how the book value of the hydros at all affects whether it's clean and carbon free or not.
Well, thank you for that. Do you know what the book value was?
I do not remember.
Okay, does 500 million sound about right?
I do not remember.
Okay, so if it was 500 million and then then we are now paying $1 billion for them, but it's not new generation. How is that Northwestern's serving Montanans with clean energy? Those are 100-year-old resources, are they not?
It's pretty simple how they're serving Montana's
Okay.
customers.
I'll move on, Mr. President. Thank you, John.
Mr. Nell, we're not just here to discuss necessarily the prudency of
I understand. I'll move on.
acquisition. Please move on.
Thank you. Would Northwestern commit to ensuring that there are no stranded costs for ratepayers if the Yellowstone gas plant, the Laurel gas plant, is in 10 years, if it comes to pass that gas is not a good way to be generating electricity, would Northwestern commit to not leaving Montanans with the stranded costs of an asset?
I think that the answer to that is pretty simple. That will be a separate hearing, which will bring this resource to the commission, and all those sort of issues will be basically discussed, aired, and decided upon ultimately by the commission at that point in time.
John, you're an economist, right?
That's correct.
Okay. What happens when people have higher rates and less discretionary income? What happens?
There's generally a decrease to just any type of inflationary factor or increase in prices, if you will. People have less disposable income.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nell. We've been going for a while again. So I could certainly use a break. So time is now 3:40 p.m. Why don't we take a 10-minute recess and we will pick up with the cross-examination of Mr. Hines. We'll go off the record.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Does seem like I'm doing too slow. Oh, gotcha. Yes. Yeah. Dr. Taryn, about that. Totally reasonable. Let me ask our paralegal limit. Yeah. We a banana. Some. Yeah. I would be happy to wheel this chair out there and trade with you if you want something more. Yeah. There's an optics problem there. Jamie can get one too, though. We've got extras. We do have extras. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Thing that happens apparently at least part of the second week of our worker reservation. So that's Wednesday. It's Tuesday. We need to do that. We reserve that, make sure that no cases. So this does Monday and Tuesday. Oh, go longer than that. So I'm gonna have Aaron get back out to Lisa. The remainder of the Frank, I think it's Monday.
Tricia, we good? Ready? Mr. Hines, you ready? Time is now 3:52 PM. We will go back on the record. We had just finished the cross-examination by 350 Montana. Mr. McGraw,
I have no questions for Mr. Hines, sir.
Mr. Ruda,
I have a few questions, but I think maybe they would be directed more appropriately to Mr. LaFave, but I just wanted to ask Mr. Hines.
all right, go ahead, Mr. Ruda.
John, I wanted to talk a little bit about the independent evaluator on the all source competitive solicitation. Would those better be directed to Mr. LaFave than to yourself?
They would, Mike.
Thanks. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Did you get that by any chance? Ms. Hornbein.
Yes, one question, Mr. President. Mr. Hines, Melissa Hornbein representing Intervenor Renewable Northwest. My question is, did Northwestern use a tiered duration structure to identify the resources which eventually led to the selection of the Yellowstone County Generating Station, if you know?
If you mean by a tiered duration schedule, did we have separate 20, 10, and 5? Yes, we did.
Correct. Okay, so just one follow-up on that. Is that, to your knowledge, a typical approach either for Northwestern or for other utilities more generally?
I can't speak to the typicality of it for other utilities. Northwestern has a very unique portfolio compared to the peers that I'm aware of in the Pacific Northwest, for example, in that we have a very high percentage of intermittent generation on our portfolio. And that causes us to have, I think, concerns, certainly concerns for us about the ability to be able to address needs over a longer time period, especially given that we are trying to address I think what's been referred to as critical loads time periods. And unlike states like California, where they can have critical loads day over day, typically it's over a few small hours, 3 to 5, 3 to 6 PM on a day. And that drives one to a different type of solution set than what we're looking at, where we can have literally a peak event. I think it was talked about earlier today of 70 hours straight. So you're correct. I don't know about the typicality from a different utilities, but that is an evolving approach that Northwestern is taking.
And would you say that the use of that approach, in other words, the tiered duration or 5, 10, and 20-hour durations, is a result of the resource structure that you just described?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part of your question.
Is the reason for selecting that tiered duration approach a result of the intermittent resource structure that you just described?
I think it's a reflection of intermittency of generation. It's a reflection of lack of baseload capacity generation on our system, a reflection of the need of our portfolio, basically our load, over a longer time period. So I'd say it's a combination of a lot of factors, but that is one of them.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
No further questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Hornbein. Mr. Helly.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Hines, for your testimony today. Just want to ask you a couple of quick questions about the budget for the Yellowstone Generating Station. In your responses to MEIC's data request, I believe this was in November, you claimed that the Yellowstone plant remained within the budget that Northwestern had projected in its pre-approval docket in 2021. Is that correct?
I believe, I'm not sure the reference. I can't remember the reference I used, but I believe the statement was correct. Yes.
And you also acknowledged in response to MEIC's data request that inflationary pressures have increased the cost of construction projects.
Overall, that is correct.
Overall, has Northwestern updated its budget for the Yellowstone plant since November?
Northwestern continues to evaluate the different pieces of the construction project going on. Given the Judge Moses's recent ruling, that has created a pause in trying to understand the budget outcomes. So we were tracking relatively onto target up until this point in time. And just to be clear, we have significantly different buckets, whether we have large equipment, the Caterpillar, equipment that has the engines, we have the EPC, we have the Northwestern contributed pieces to it. And all of those are always in flux, sometimes a little over budget, sometimes under budget. But from a total project perspective, which is frankly where I'm most concerned about, we were generally in alignment with our total budget estimate.
So just to be clear, you said generally tracking, relatively tracking. Are you on budget at this point? Is the project exceeding what had been projected in the pre-approval docket?
Could you help? I'll answer your question, but could you help me? Oh, in the pre-approval docket that was pulled, is that, I'm sorry, I got it a little slow. I don't remember the number specifically in the pre-approval docket. I would say that this project is tracking very similarly to around the $275 million project, total project.
Okay, for what I have in front of me, it says estimated construction cost of $250,811,631.
Can we put whatever that document is, Mr. Helly, if you want to ask him a question about it?
I apologize. This is Northwestern's response to MEIC 13, which I believe has already been admitted. Okay. Thank you. No. So these are the numbers from that 2021 docket. It says there's a $286 million overall budget, which includes construction costs of just over $250 million. I guess $800,000 over $250 million, which is quite a bit more. But is that $250 million figure still good, or are the $270 million figure you just quoted, is that for construction costs, meaning the project is now over budget?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Again, my understanding of this data response is that the $275 million number that I gave you links up to both the construction costs and AFUDC and other pieces that are also listed in there. So if you sum those up, it's approximately the same amount.
Okay. No further questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Helly. Vice President Fielder.
I have no questions at this time.
Commissioner Bukacek.
I have a question. Based on my understanding of line 29 of exhibit MCC 6, if you could get him a copy of that, please. So based on my understanding of line 29, there was about a 10-fold exaggeration.
Hold on, Commissioner Bukacek. Do you have MCC 6 in front of you, Mr. Hines?
I do not yet.
All right. Can you hold off, Commissioner Bukacek?
Uh-oh. You got me.
So based on my understanding of line 29, there was a 10-fold exaggeration of the bill impact of the current proposed settlement by one of the public commenters this morning. And there were quite a few of the public commenters that kind of nodded in agreement. So I think there's a large misunderstanding of the impact on the monthly statement. And Mr. President, if you could indulge me with giving some background information, I will make it relevant to my question.
Commissioner Bukacek, you have freedom to ask your question.
Thank you. All right. So I've had over 40 years of analyzing medical data and statistical analysis of various things. And one of the things that comes up in medicine, and I will make this relevant, is relative risk versus absolute risk. So when we're looking at disease entities or complications of medications and so on, there's the relative risk versus absolute risk. And relative risks involves a percentage, and absolute risk involves numbers. And so there's a big, this was like 20 years ago, the Women's Health Initiative, it showed a 27% increase in something, and it caused women to make all kinds of medical, I'm sorry.
Excuse me, that's pretty funny.
It caused women to make a lot of medical decisions based on that 27 to 28% increase in an incidence of breast cancer. But it only, when they look at the absolute risk, it was only 7 or 8 women. So the 27 to 28% looked horrible, scared a lot of people, but it really only amounted to 7 or 8 women that were affected by it. So I'm listening this week to the different percentages, and it just brought me back to those days of how percentages, and the media jumps on percentages, makes it sound, everything sound, worse than it really is in terms of people's everyday lives. So this week we saw 18.2% increases, 28%, 15% rise in bills for the residential customer.
Commissioner Bukacek, you really need to slow down, please.
Put that in front of me. Oh,
Okay, just
that would help.
slowly.
I'm so sorry. So there were questions about, does the rise include property taxes, the increase in PCAM base and deferment? Does it involve other variables? How are the residential rates subsidized? All these things were talked about this week. Subjective and objective measures of rate shock. But in my opinion, if I'm understanding this document here, it didn't give adequate attention to this week, all the proceedings, and I'm not saying it was intentional, but it didn't give adequate attention to the predicted absolute rise in the power bill as opposed to the percent rise. So just like with medical data, percent rise makes it sound horrible. The actual rise, maybe not so much in medical data. So I'm thinking it might be the same thing here. So if you could look, am I doing better? Speed wise? So if you look at line 29, so this is residential electric utility services bill impact analysis, and line 29 is the total bill. And if you look under, and this is for 750 kilowatt hours per month. And if you look at column E, it says that the current bill would be $91.27. And with the proposed, if you include the PCAM decrease, the PCAM evaluation. Okay, so it goes up to $116.64. So the total increase of the bill, it looks like, would be $25.37. And that would be the 28% increase that includes PCAM and all that. So we're talking about the person that exaggerated tenfold this morning, if I'm understanding correctly. She said that the monthly bill would go up $200 to $300. That's a tenfold exaggeration. It would actually be more like 20 to 30. Is that correct based on line 29?
Under Commissioner, under the example that you talked about, that is correct. And by the way, I love statistics. I went to graduate school with math and stats, so
I can't get enough.
Yeah, so we're both junkies on it. But absolute, I think both pieces do provide relevant information. And absolute, though, is certainly important when you're looking at a household's budget. That's the bottom line, if you will. Percentages certainly are indicative, but I concur with that. And I would say, without going too far down the path of PCAM, and Joe Steinmetz is the witness who will be coming on after me, who's from a supply perspective can best talk about PCAM. Those are reflective basically of costs. We have our own rate-based costs, we have power purchase costs, we have market purchase costs. We have very little control on our market purchase costs, especially for our capacity contracts. Our capacity contracts have two pieces to it. They have a flat monthly type of capacity payment that you make. And then you have whenever you call on that contract, then you're paying some market proxy. It might be actually the market at that point in time. It could be some kind of gas market relationship type of thing, but nonetheless, you have exposure at that piece. And in order for us to meet our customers' needs during those critical times, we do call on those capacity contracts. And that's where you get such a big increase on the PCAM component. What we really are talking about here is that column E to column H. And I'm not the person who can give you the detail on that, but I totally concur with you on absolute and percentage wise.
So the historic unprecedented increase that people are talking about, it's $25 to $30 a month. For me, that's the cost of 3 to 4 dozen eggs. So I think it's important that we have that perspective for the individual residential customer. Follow up? Just go ahead. So the average household in Montana is 858 kilowatts per month. So if I can extrapolate based on line 29, that would be $29.94, or roughly $30 a month, subject to check.
I would say on the extrapolation, there's one component of that is you can extrapolate with that, but the fixed cost component doesn't deviate from the amount of usage. So, that's a fixed piece in your bill. And then how much energy you're consuming is the piece that is subject to variability, just when you're doing your mathematical pieces there.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Now the students in the dorm or other student housing, one of them talked about having 5 roommates. So let's say they had the average household, they'd be splitting that bill between 5 people. It'd be about $6 a month. So, power, it's a service that we need to live and flourish, has a proposed increase of about $1 a day, give or take. And if the total bill was roughly $125 a month, let's just say on average, with a rise of $30 a month. And if that was more than an individual or a family could afford, I did a quick internet search last night, and there are multiple government and nonprofit programs that will support those people that truly can't afford the $30 increase or the $125 total. And so it's very, very easy to get a hold of. And I looked under Flathead Electric Co-op, because that's where I'm from. And I looked at Northwestern, and that information is basically available on the front page,
And
a link to it at least.
And that's something that we've been trying to do. We recognize that some of our customers have significant financial problems. I think last numbers I saw, I was on a governor's low income task force for a while, and I think something like around 25 to 30% of Montana customer base is low income. So I absolutely do not want to set aside those issues for those people. It's real, but we're trying to avail them of as many mechanisms as possible to help them through this.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
No more questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Bukacek. I don't have any questions for this witness at this time, Mr. Hamilton.
No questions.
Okay, time for recross. Ms. Trinnell. Mr. Uda.
No questions.
Ms. Hornbein.
No questions.
Mr. Heller.
No questions. Thank you.
Okay. Northwestern Energy may redirect.
Sorry, I was conferring with co-counsel. I do have a little bit of redirect. Thank you. Mr. Hines, you were having a conversation with Ms. Trinnell about the capacity plan and the revenue requirement for Yellowstone. Do you recall that conversation?
The capacity plan, I don't recall that being part of a discussion, but.
Or the IRP. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Correct.
So is it fair to point to the revenue requirement included in ADD 17 for the actual data related to Yellowstone, or at least what was presented in the
I'm sorry, I don't recognize the numbers.
Andy Durkin's Exhibit 17, the revenue requirement data.
I can't say it is fair.
So let's talk a little bit about the hydro docket as much as I would prefer not to. Can you clarify how carbon was used, the concept of carbon was used to justify the purchase price in the hydro docket?
Excuse me. The hydro docket, the hydros themselves had, first of all, we had an entity, EPL Montana, that initially indicated that they were wanting to sell their entire portfolio. And if Northwestern was interested, you know, we should have a conversation with them. At that point in time, we indicated that we weren't interested in the entire portfolio that they had. And we were only interested in acquiring the hydro docket or the hydro resources. Fortunately, they're willing to have that discussion. And then we employed a team of advisors that came up with different mechanisms in which we would evaluate this. So there wasn't one single metric that was used. Bottom line was they had a number that we either agreed to or they'd go out and shop that number. So then we looked at different ways. Could we justify that to our customers, to our commission? And we used a variety of different mechanisms to justify that. One of the ways that we justified it is we did basically what I call a discounted cash flow. We looked at the megawatt hours that would be produced over an extended time period, put a price on that from an energy perspective, no capacity perspective. And what Ms. Turnell and I were talking about was there a carbon piece added to that energy price? And there was, but there were other mechanisms by which we were able to justify the cost of the resource beyond that. And then, as I noted with Ms. Turnell, is that we were doing that in compliance with what the commission expected us to do, that carbon analysis at that point in time. Subsequent to then, we have a prohibition about being able to actually purchase a resource based upon a carbon analysis. But as I also pointed out, the capacity value, which was not valued at all at that point in time, has significant value to our resources. In fact, I think you could make a strong argument that if those resources were put up for sale again right now, the value of those resources are substantially greater than what we paid back then, even with a escalation factor.
So would it be fair to talk to perhaps Ms. Lael about the specific financial components of the price of the hydros?
Absolutely.
Mr. Hines, was the hydro purchased by Northwestern fully vetted before the commission in the acquisition docket in 2014?
It certainly was.
Are the hydro assets a carbon resource?
They are not.
In your opinion, as the vice president for supply at Northwestern, were the hydros a good and valuable resource to acquire for the customers?
I've heard it characterized this way, and I wholly support it. It's the crown jewel of our portfolio. It provides a stable amount of power over time. By stable, it does not flatline the entire year, but we know how much it's going to produce month to month to month, just because it's a fairly easy calculation, hydrology and head and, you know, our engines at the plants. So it provides a critical base load, and since it's in rate base, again, we have very little operating costs, similar to wind and solar. You know, as far as actual fuel costs, the fuel is free. It pours down the river. So to me, it is a linchpin or a crown jewel of our resources by which we manage all of the other resources around.
You had a give and take with Ms. Trinnell about whether or not the commission should assess all of the resources contained in rate base in this docket. Do you recall that conversation?
I do.
In your opinion, as an executive of the company, what impact would it have on the utilities business to know that the entire rate base and generation resource portfolio would be reassessed in every rate review?
I can only provide my personal perspective. I don't deal directly with investors. That's more Ms. Lael's function, but investors want stability. It's really, well, that's what we want too. We want a clear path how we're supposed to proceed, but investors demand stability. And if there's more risk, uncertainty, then they're putting risk premiums to us. The cost of debt, the ability to issue capital are all impaired.
Do those risk premiums hurt customers?
Absolutely.
So you had some discussion with Ms. Trinnell about climate. And what percentage of Northwestern's portfolio today is carbon free?
There's different metrics that can be used, whether it's total capacity comparison amongst our different groups. Typically, we use an energy comparison, how many megawatt hours are produced by the hydro, wind, coal plants, gas plants. And this last year, I believe we were around 59%. And that's decreased a little bit because from past years, and that's a function of our coal plants and our gas plants will run more times, more hours over the course of the year because they were basically more cost effective for our customers than going out to the market. So thus the amount of carbon emitting megawatt hours was increased in order to better serve our customers.
So I want to point you back to your deposition transcript. That was from a different case, right? That wasn't taken in this docket.
I can't remember what it was taken in context of, but it was not this docket.
There was Ms. Trinnell had you read a Q&A about whether or not the Laurel/Yellowstone gas plant would contribute to climate change. Was there anything in your deposition that in your mind contradicted your testimony here today?
Absolutely not. In fact, I believe in that context, even it says it may cause climate change. It certainly emits carbon. And as I talked about in my conversation with Ms. Trinnell, the amount of tons of carbon expected to be emitted from this plant vis-a-vis both national, well, I'll even go just local area, national, and certainly international is very, very small. And in addition, you look at most air quality permitting processes, look at a netting, if you're going to emit mercury or particulate in this manner, in another piece of that air shed, are you decreasing it so that there can be a conclusion reached? And my only point in discussing the amount of carbon that has decreased from thermal generation in that area was to be basically illustrative of that air quality permitting concept that net, there's a decrease in carbon emittance from thermal generation in that area, even with the addition of the Yellowstone plant.
Great. I'd like to move on and this is my last area, touch on the conversation that you had with Ms. Trinnell about advertising. Of course, advertising always has a negative connotation, but in addition to educating customers, does Northwestern also use advertising, for lack of a better word, to provide safety information to its customers?
That was an obvious miss on my part. Yeah, all before you dig is a great example.
Are you aware that Montana statute, I think it's 69.3.307, governs what advertising expenses a public utility is allowed to add to customer rate base?
I am not aware of that.
Mr. Chairman, that's all I have for redirect.
Thank you, Ms. Heim.
We would ask to permanently excuse Mr. Hines.
All right, is there objection to permanently excusing this witness? Seeing none? Hines, thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend, I guess.
Thank you. Safe travels. Thank you for being here today. All right, parties. So before we call the next witness, we are Friday, 4/23. We are definitely going to do the second week of this hearing. I suspect now substantially far into the week of next week. So I'm going to do some housekeeping matters. Okay, for those that are participating by Zoom, this is important. For technical reasons, the Zoom invitation for the second week of the hearing will be different than the Zoom invitation for the first week of the hearing. Commission staff has sent a new invitation for the second week of the hearing to everyone who has received an invitation at any point during the first week of the hearing. So please be sure to check your spam folder if you do not see the invitation in your inbox. If you know anyone who needs a Zoom invitation for week 2 and who has not received an invitation, please contact the commission staff. So again, shorthand, if you received a Zoom invitation for this week, it will not work for next week. You will need a new Zoom invitation. Second thing is that we had been starting at 8:30 a.m. for the last several days of this hearing. I've had several requests from the parties not to start until 9 o'clock Monday. I'm amenable to granting that, so we will start at 9 a.m. on Monday in order to give parties time to get back here for the second week of this hearing. The time, I don't know if you can do this off the cuff, but how many more witnesses do you have for your case in chief at this point?
I will defer to Ms. Norcott, who is counting.
Okay. All right. What I would like to do with the remaining time for today is, are you still counting? All right. So it looks like 11 witnesses still left for Northwestern Energy's case in chief. What I'd like to do is to have you call your next witness. We'll get them sworn in. We'll move their testimony. And then I think what we'll do is we'll break for the day at the point of cross-examination, if that is amenable to the parties.
I did have a question. I think a housekeeping matter is if I didn't move for the admission of 350 Exhibit 16, which was Mr. Hines' deposition, I want to move for that.
You did not move it.
Okay, I'd move for the admission of that 350 Montana Exhibit 16.
Northwestern would object to its admission. It was, I believe Ms. Trudell was trying to use it for impeachment purposes. She asked her questions. I don't think it needs to be admitted into the record. I would also note that the document that she provided is filled with yellow highlights, so it's not really a true and accurate copy of the original.
Or no?
I'm happy to substitute it with a clean copy. I did it rather quickly, so I apologize for that. I can substitute the clean copy, and I would note that Northwestern asked redirect from the deposition transcript and asked to complete Mr. Hines' testimony. So I think it's appropriately in the record so that we can all fairly point to the portions of it that we were citing.
Mr. President, just to be more clear, I guess I'm objecting to the entire transcript being moved into the record. I'm not opposed to the specific pages that were referenced being moved as an exhibit.
Ms. Trudell, I would be inclined to grant that limitation. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I do. It's not actually that long of a deposition. And I think that those extracting certain pages would require, I think this was important to the answer of is carbon in the hydros? What's climate change mean? Those were the nature of the questions. That was the redirect that Northwestern elicited. And I think in fairness, it should all be there.
I'm ready to rule on this. I am going to deny the request to admit that document. I believe the record in this manner will fairly represent what was contained in the deposition and what was answered by the witness. Any other housekeeping matters?
I would ask that the commission take administrative notice of the final order in the hydro docket. I think it's 7342K or something like that. The final order in the docket D 2013-1285.
This is our commission's own final order. We will take administrative notice of our own order. Okay. Any other housekeeping matters? Northwestern Energy, can you call your next witness?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Northwestern calls Mr. Blue LaFave. Mr. LaFave.
Have you been sworn, Mr. LaFave? All right, you have raised your right hand, so thank you. Mr. LaFave, do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth? All right, thank you, Mr. LaFave, and welcome.
Good afternoon. Could you state your name and business address for the record?
Yes, my name is Blue LaFave, BLEAU. Last name is LaFave, LAFAVE. And my business address is 3010 West 69th Street, Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
By whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
What is your title with Northwestern?
I'm the Director of Long-Term Resources.
Did you submit pre-filed testimony in this docket?
I did.
And do you have that testimony before you?
I do.
Is that testimony identified as the pre-filed direct testimony of Blue J. LaFave and the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Blue J. LaFave?
They are.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do. Two small corrections. Starting on BJL, page 10.
Of direct or rebuttal?
I'm sorry, of direct. Page 10 in the table behind Yellowstone County, it says the nameplate. That nameplate should be 175, not 165. And then following on that, the accredited capacity would be 168.5 instead of 160. And then on BJ 12, it'd be a similar correction on Yellowstone County on the table where it says 165, that should say 175. BJL 12.
And is that all the corrections?
That is.
Mr. Chairman, I move to admit the pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. LaFave as Exhibit 17, Northwestern Exhibit 17.
As amended.
As amended.
All right, is there any objection to the admission of Northwest Energy Exhibit 17 as amended? Seeing none, Exhibit 17 by Northwest Energy as amended is admitted.
And I move to admit the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Mr. LaFave as Northwestern Exhibit 18.
Is there any objection to the admission of Northwest Energy Exhibit 18? Seeing none, Northwest Energy Exhibit 18 is admitted. So
I tender the witness for cross-examination.
okay. So what we're going to do is stop here, but just a couple reminders. One is if you got a Zoom invitation for this week, you will need a new Zoom invitation for next week. If you have questions, check with the commission staff. Second thing is we did have our staff make a request of all the parties. And sometimes we are hitting the 5 o'clock hour, going a little past in this hearing at the gentle request of the Montana Public Service and Commission staff. Please vacate as timely as possible the state building so that they may go home. So I try to give yourself a 10-minute leeway to vacate the offices, please, at the end of the day. I would appreciate your indulgence in that. Again, we will start at 9 a.m. on Monday. Seeing no further business for today, the time is 4:32 p.m. We will go off the record. Enjoy your weekend.